Hi, everyone. This is Rosemary Coates in Silicon Valley. I'm your host for this edition of the Frictionless Supply Chain podcast. I'm the executive director of the Reshoring Institute, where we help companies bring back or expand their manufacturing in the US, and I'm a contributing writer to Supply Chain Management Review. Today, I'm very excited to welcome Pamela Bracher. She's a lawyer and deputy general counsel at the American Trucking Association. The American Trucking Association is the largest and most comprehensive national trade association for the trucking industry. And I'm going to let her tell you a little bit more about the organization. So let's get started. Welcome, Pam.
Thank you for having me. I'm very grateful, Rosemary.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit more about your background and how you came to work at the ATA.
I was raised in East Tennessee. I went to undergrad at Emory University in Atlanta and then ultimately got a master's in public administration. Financial management was the emphasis there, and my law degree from the University of Cincinnati. I always knew that I was going to be a defense trial attorney. When I was in when I graduated from Emory, I actually became a litigation paralegal and worked at King and Spalding in Atlanta while I started my master's program. And I worked with an attorney by the name of Chilton Varner, and we worked on products liability cases and false negative pap smear cases. And so at that point, I kind of knew that I was going to be a defense trial attorney. So I actually joined a law firm based in Chattanooga when I graduated from law school, and I was in private practice there for several years, again in their litigation department. I ultimately went in-house at US Express, which is a Chattanooga-based trucking company. I was there for about 17 years. Left and went to Knight Swift, which is also a trucking company based in Phoenix, Arizona. And I was there for about a year and a half, maybe a little less than a year and a half, when the American Trucking Associations and kind of, I guess you might say, we had a conversation about this opportunity. Um, my current boss was the deputy general counsel, and he had been promoted to the general counsel role. And they needed to backfill his position or his former position. And what is interesting is in the trade association world, oftentimes folks that work at trade associations don't necessarily come from the industries that they support. They might come from another trade association. And so the biggest thing that I work on is tort reform at the state level. So one of the reasons why I think it was a interesting proposition that I joined the ATA is that I was actually coming from the world of defending tort cases, personal injury, wrongful death cases, and had spent 20 years doing that on behalf of trucking companies. So it's something I understood. It's my bread and butter. It's my
Yeah,
comfort.
that's got to be a tremendous advantage for ATA to have you actually have background in the trucking industry for sure.
Right, right. So that's kind of, so I joined the ATA in November of 2022. So I'm coming up on my 3-year anniversary. And you already mentioned that the American Trucking Associations, and it's plural associations because we are a federation of 50 state trucking associations, as well as several different councils and conferences. The councils are usually sort of subject matter oriented, I guess you might say, like the National Accounting and Finance Council or the Safety Management Council. And then our conferences are more in line with maybe, I guess you might say, subsets of the industry. For example, Automobile Carriers Conference, Moving and Storage Conference. And so we're a federation of, as I said, the 50 state trucking associations, these 5 councils, and 5 conferences. And then in addition, in our federation, we have the National Tank Truck Carriers, the Truckload Carriers Association, the Trucking Association Executives Council, and then our data research arm, the American Transportation Research Institute.
So is it fair to say you provide services and community, I guess, for trucking for
Right,
truckers across the nation and
right.
trucking
So
companies?
right. So we're a member-driven voice of the of member-driven voice of trucking, national trade association. We lobby at the federal level on legislative and regulatory matters of importance, trade and border, tax, infrastructure, workforce, energy and environment, security, all of those things. Safety is obviously a large part. Safety policy and safety compliance is a large part of our mission. And then through our federation of 50 state trucking associations, we work on lawsuit abuse, predatory towing reform. I support those state associations in that manner.
Okay, all right. So can you give us a couple of examples of cases that you've worked on? So you said there's some legislation pieces, there's some safety
Yeah,
pieces, that sort of thing.
right. So my background is trial work, and so spent all of my time doing tort litigation. And as I jokingly have said, it's not my joke. It's existed for all times. A tort is not a really awesome dessert. Tort, spelled T-O-R-T, is just another way of saying negligence law. So that large part of state law that has to do with personal injury and wrongful death cases. And so
Okay.
that's where I've spent my
Just
whole career.
just for clarification, there are attorneys out there that work on like contract law or real estate or
Right.
estate law, and then there are trial attorneys that actually uh, pursue cases in court, right?
Right, right. So you have trial attorneys that are pursuing cases in court. And so you could have a case in court that was really a breach of contract case. And I certainly did some of those things when I was in private practice. But for the most part, I've done personal injury and wrongful death. And so at the ATA, what we are doing is trying to reform what we call lawsuit abuses that have been, so there's sort of I guess you might say, a shifting in the balance in the courtroom as it impacts the defense of personal injury lawsuits, and sometimes that has to do with um, judicial interpretations around what is relevant, what should be admitted into evidence. Sometimes that has to do with actual state law. For example, in many states, the fact that the injured plaintiff who is suing the trucking company was not wearing his or her seatbelt, that's not something that the state law would allow as admissible evidence. Most people probably appreciate that if you don't wear your seatbelt, that in and of itself could have caused your injury, or at least had you been wearing your seatbelt, you might still have been injured, but your injury would not be as severe. Um, Another example is in many states, what is admissible into evidence is the medical bills in the amount billed. And most people that have any working knowledge of how health insurance works, or even workers' compensation, Medicare, Medicaid, they know that there's usually a lesser amount than the billed amount, which is actually paid for that medical treatment. But oftentimes in many courtrooms, jurors don't get to hear the medical amount paid. And so they're assuming that the damages are off of some higher inflated number that isn't really a true damage. It's in essence a phantom damage. And so, yeah, so through our state trucking associations, we try to pass reform laws, which sometimes goes by the terminology lawsuit abuse reform, sometimes it goes by the terminology tort reform. But our goal is to just bring balance and fairness into the courtroom.
Okay. As you know, I do some expert witness work, and
Yeah.
I've worked on a couple of trucking accident cases that were pretty gory. Um, You know, in an accident like that, people usually have lots of injuries and death often, and so I
Yes.
try to stay away from those now. But
Yeah, yeah. No, it can definitely be gory. I mean, the truth of the matter is most of the accidents that happen are actually not the fault of a truck driver. They're usually the fault of some other party. The problem is that when you have a crash, and sometimes bad things happen to good people, it truly is an accident. And when you have a crash with an 80,000 pound vehicle, it can be severe, right? It can
yeah,
be life changing.
yeah, yeah. It's a good warning to all of us to give truckers plenty of room and to maneuver and to stop and so forth, and not follow too close and so forth, right?
Exactly, exactly.
So, just to change subjects a little bit, a lot of our listeners may not be aware of the differences between asset-based carriers and truck brokers, which I know both are included in ATA's membership. Can you explain a little bit about what the difference is and how they operate differently?
So true brokers are actually not usually members of the ATA. Typically, they would be members of our colleague trade association, the Transportation Intermediaries Association. But many of our members do have a brokerage business unit. So, an asset based motor carrier is a motor carrier that actually has tractors and trailers, right?
They have assets,
And
right?
they're hauling the load. And now I worked the two trucking companies that I work for, both US Express and Knight Swift, are examples of asset-based motor carriers. But in addition, within the corporate structure, they had business units that functioned as brokerages. So they would take loads from customers. Maybe the customer was the asset based side of the business, but the customer could have also been, one of our many retail stores that we all frequent as consumers. And they're going to broker that load as a, traditional way, where that meaning that they're going to take that load from the shipper and they're going to match it to a motor carrier out there and assign that load to them. And usually there's, you know, agreements and contracts in place. But the broker isn't actually hauling the load. It's just sort of an agent, if you will. Think of it like Match.com.
Yeah.
It's like they're taking the load from the shipper and they're matching it with the motor carrier and they're getting the load from point A to point B.
Well,
Uh,
that strikes me then that there are all kinds of legal implications. In response to that, I mean, if there's an accident and you've been working with a truck broker, who's responsible? Is it the broker or the carrier or the truck driver? Or, it's interesting.
well, that's a huge debate that's actually going on right now. There is sort of a split in authority. So what's happening in the personal injury world is that plaintiffs there's a crash, a plaintiff is injured. The plaintiff goes and gets representation with a plaintiff attorney, and that attorney will sometimes sue the truck driver, the company that the truck driver either works for or is contracted or leased onto as an independent contractor or an owner operator, and then will additionally sue the broker. And the theory that against the broker is essentially a negligent selection or a negligent uh,
Right.
hiring type claim. And
So when a company like Knight Swift or one of those has their own truck drivers and their own assets. They sort of curate and make sure the background is appropriate. They verify licenses and all of that. But when you're in a broker situation and you're farming this load out to somebody else, you don't have that control, right?
Well, you have some control, but you have to have a healthy balance between what you're doing when, in terms of vetting your carrier and and the direction that you're giving to the motor carrier and how you're monitoring the load while the motor carrier is hauling it. Because it's kind of one of those things where if you control them too much, if you vet them too much, it is easier for a plaintiff's attorney to make the argument that the broker is in fact a principal and there's some sort of principal agent relationship between the broker and the motor carrier, which then makes it an easier reach to show that the broker negligently hired that carrier or negligently supervised that carrier.
Wow, it's a big cautionary flag for those of us who are in the shipping business, to make
Yes.
sure that we know what we're doing and who we're hiring and who the broker is passing it off to and so forth. I mean, it gets complicated and more sophisticated than you would think.
Right. You want to exercise some engagement, but you don't want to be fully engaged as a traditional employer with employee would be, perhaps. That's why I use the terminology healthy balance. I'm not sure if that's the best descriptor, but yeah. But anyway, to going back to your earlier question, there is sort of a split in the federal circuits right now over whether or not brokers can be held liable on theories like we just outlined. You've got you got the Seventh and 11th circuits are siding and saying brokers should not be held liable in that manner. You've got the Sixth and the Ninth circuits saying that those types of claims can proceed against brokers. And when I say
Wow.
circuits, I'm talking about the federal appellate court circuits. And so all of this is ramping up to potentially review by the United States Supreme Court on this issue.
Wow, very interesting. So there's all sorts of twists and turns, I guess.
Yes,
And if
yes,
you're involved in a claim, it can be quite daunting in terms of the complexity.
yes, it can be.
So let's talk about claims then. What is so this is one of those terms that I learned long, long ago when I was an undergrad in transportation management, the Carmack Amendment, and
Yeah.
how that plays into the limits of liability if you do have a claim. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, the Carmack Amendment is basically it's federal law, and the intent of the Carmack Amendment was to govern the liability of motor carriers in the truck, and I'll say in the trucking world, I'll use the term motor carriers for loss, damage, and delay of goods during interstate transportation. What it really sort of does is set up kind of a national framework of how cargo claims would be handled. And that framework, because it's federal law, supersedes any conflicting state law. And really, quite honestly, the Carback Amendment is what we call strict liability. In other words, the motor carrier, if the cargo is lost, damaged, or delayed, the motor carrier under the Carmack Amendment is responsible for that loss, damage, or delay. And there are very few exceptions that exist under the Carmack Amendment. One of them, for example, might be act of God. Like there was a tornado, or that flipped the trailer, damaging the cargo. But there really are very few exceptions that the motor carrier can use as a defense. So if the cargo is lost, damaged, or delayed, um, more than likely the motor carrier is going to have to pay that claim. And so when I was in house, the experience that we mostly had frustrations with was really the timeline that's put in place by the Carmack. And I jokingly used to say to the folks that were cargo claims examiners that worked that worked in my department that I had oversight over, it always fascinated me how long it took the shipper or the customer, depending upon, well, I guess customer can be the consignee or the shipper, but it always interested me how long sometimes it took them to make their claim. If I were out money, I would want to go quickly and get my money, right? But under the Carmack, you have the shipper has to file its claim within 9 months from the date of delivery, and that's a minimum 9 months. And sometimes you can contractually agree to a longer period of time. So, I mean, when I was at the trucking companies, we had some contracts with some of our on some of our dedicated accounts where we would let them take 12 months instead of 9 months to present their cargo
Well,
claim.
I suppose there are some cases. I mean, yeah, you would think you have a claim, you're going to file a claim right away, right? But I would think there's some cases where it may be not obvious that there's a claim where, the machine doesn't work or, something happens or, 3 months later you open up the back of the crate and you find damage that you hadn't noticed before. So, it's possible that there's some delay in that regard too, but I agree with you. It does seem like a long time, 9 months
Yeah,
to file a claim. That's a long time.
yeah,
Yeah.
9 months just to file a claim, 12 months just to file a claim. And I agree with you in the sense that there are sometimes things that aren't immediately obvious, but a lot of times I felt when I was in house at least, there were many times where I felt that it was really disorganization on the part of the shipper. Like it's almost like the right hand and the left hand weren't their workflow, their process wasn't exactly synced up. And so you have some sort of boots on the ground distribution center that was aware that there was a problem, but headquarters is where the claims people are that submit the cargo claims, and there's some lack of timely communication between the boots on the ground and the administrative people that are going to fill out the claim paperwork. And so I
Yeah.
felt like that was more prevalent than we just didn't know. It wasn't, the damage wasn't immediately identifiable.
So what should shippers do to minimize their risk and make sure that they don't have damage? Other than,
Um,
an act of God or whatever. I mean, some of
yeah.
that stuff is going to happen automatically, but surely there are things that shippers can do to minimize their risk.
Yeah, I mean, at a very general high level, um, statement that I would make is that I think shippers need to be intellectually honest with their risk assessment. They have to know the vulnerabilities in their process, their workflow, their transportation chain, and they have to be able to allow themselves to be vulnerable enough to admit those weaknesses so that they can then identify solutions. Um, some of those solutions are obviously going to require a cost benefit analysis over whether or not a capital investment should be made. And I'm not in everybody's P&L, but sometimes that's where the driver of the toughest decisions are. Can we make that capital investment? Do we want to make that capital investment? But you have to begin with being intellectually honest about what your weaknesses are and not just sort of ignore them.
So
Um,
when you're talking about weaknesses, you mean in the approach to packaging or
it could
in,
be anything. It could be anything. It could be any of their workflows, any of their processes, how they staff, again, how they might staff a distribution center where loads are picked up versus the software platforms that they use to track inventory. It could be anything. It could be anything, and there's so many threats, not just there are so many threats just in the global supply chain, not just to shippers. Um, that there are potentially a lot of I guess process improvements, which is not my forte, admittedly, but I just do think that people have to be a little bit. I saw that a lot where nobody really want to you have to identify your systemic issues and you have to be willing to fix your systemic issues.
yeah, yeah, really interesting. I mean, the the progress that business has made over the last 25 or 30 years is really astounding. I started out my career as a shipping dock manager out of college, and we were sort of disconnected from the rest of the organization. We
Yeah.
just made sure the boxes got off the dock every day. And there wasn't much thought in terms of what process was before or after, um, that dock shipping kind of environment. Today's environment is so different, including technology and computer systems that are used throughout an organization. So on that note, can you tell us a little bit more about some of the technology improvements and what has changed in the trucking environment over the past few years?
I'm sort of I've said to you this before, I'm kind of I consider myself a tech idiot because and I make this joke that when I retire that I'm going to go off the grid because I really don't know or understand technology. And I have to say that outside of my scope is things are technology platforms that would be used more on the operational side of the business. What I know is the technology that's used in my world, which is more on the safety side of the business. Things that we do to mitigate risk, going back to your highway accident, your crash scenarios. And,
And
you
can you give us
know,
a few examples? Because there's like,
yeah, the biggest thing for us in our world is the more prevalent use of dash cams, right? And some trucking companies, most trucking companies have dash cameras. At least our members at the ATA, they have dash cams. Members of
so and
state trucking
that
associations.
records what the trucker is seeing, right?
Correct,
And
right.
also speed and
Yeah, it can record a lot of telematics, a lot of different information, as well as just even all of our vehicles, our own personal cars are getting more
yeah.
sophisticated in terms of all of the modules that, record data around speed, sudden events, braking, all of those things. But the dash cams, so you can have two kinds of dash cams. You can have what are called outward facing dash cams. So that is if you're that's recording what is outside the truck, right, what the driver is seeing on the road. And then you have inward facing cameras, which would be recording what the driver, or if it happens to be a co-driver situation, it might record both drivers in the cab. And the biggest part for me though is really the outward facing cameras, because in my world, before there were cameras, you either you had to classify your accidents in one of three ways. You either knew that your driver caused the accident, or you clearly knew that your driver didn't cause the accident, and the third category was there's some dispute over who caused the accident, who was the negligent driver, my truck driver or the driver of the other vehicle. With outward facing dash cams, that universe of dispute over who really caused the accident, most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, that's cleared up because you now have a recording of how the accident happened. And so you can say, very easily, oh, my truck driver is the cause, or oh, the other driver of the other vehicle is the cause. And so the universe of disputed liability, as we call it, is getting much smaller.
Is the technology just forward facing, so what the driver sees, but also the reverse? Because the
So
accidents aren't always in front of you, they may be behind you, right?
right, so there's not a lot of camera devices that are recording vehicles behind the tractor and trailer. As I said, some trucking companies have what are called inward facing cameras that are recording the driver.
Right. So you could tell if
So
the
you would
driver was sleepy or something like that.
Right. It would record if your truck driver was on the phone or sleepy or otherwise engaging in some type of distracted driver behavior. But there's not a lot of use of cameras that record vehicles behind the tractor trailer. No.
Okay. All right. Well, that was really interesting. I think there's a lot of technology advances in driving that hopefully should help reduce the amount of accidents and train drivers better and to really be a good source for continued improvement in safety and fewer claims in the future.
Right. I mean, you hit upon a big thing with the dash cams. The value comes in using them for coaching, right? Trucking companies can use the video footage to coach their drivers that have not performed as well. They can also use the videos to coach and praise drivers that have performed exceptionally well. And that is a key feature of, if you have dash cams, you need to have, a pretty good counseling program so that you're using the opportunity of these videos to teach drivers in a continuous education way.
Yeah, that's the key. There's a lot of information out there, but how do you use that information to be able to improve your operations is something different.
Right.
Well, Pam, you've had such a long and successful career in the trucking industry. What advice can you give to women and men as they develop their careers in supply chain management and logistics?
Well, before I give my advice, I thought I would share this. So one of the things that I mentioned, or one of the groups that I mentioned early on in our federation, the American Trucking Associations Federation, is the American Transportation Research Institute. And they recently published a report which is available on their website around driver demographics. Like, I think it just came out this week. And one of the pieces of data that I learned from reading this report was that in the transportation sector, and this is truck drivers, dispatchers, could be people that are working in the back office of trucking companies like bookkeepers, accounting, customer service reps, load planners. 12.6% are women in the
Wow.
overall sort of universe of employees
Well, that
in the
sounds like a
transportation.
grand opportunity for women, for sure.
Exactly. It is a grand opportunity for women, for sure. Now, what is interesting is within that 12%, the largest percentages of women typically are in sort of what I call those back office functions, like bookkeeping, accounting, claims work, administrative or clerical type jobs, and they're not necessarily working as dispatchers or truck drivers or lead managers or lead load planners or things like that. So lots of opportunity for women. But in terms of the advice that I would give to a young person, regardless of male or female, is first. I don't know that these are in any particular order, but just I'll list them. First of all, never stop learning. Um,
Great.
it's foolish for you to think, well, I've graduated from this logistics program at this college and I have nothing else to learn. I'm at the top of my game. So I think it's always important to stay current and to never stop learning. We are lifelong students, so much for us to learn. Don't shy away from lateral moves. That's another piece of advice. I think sometimes when I had young people reporting to me, they were always interested in the upward mobility. And sometimes a lateral move is a way for you to gain experience across different aspects of the supply chain, which ultimately will get you that promotion because you have a more, you have a greater breadth of knowledge. Um, the other two things are sort of related, I guess. Sometimes some of the young folks that used to report to me were not always great at taking initiative. I really feel like if you want to succeed, if you want to develop your professional career, you're really going to have to volunteer for some things and you're really going to have to lean in. You're going to have to raise your hand and say, let me have that opportunity, please. And you're going to have to develop soft skills around that, your leadership, your collaboration, and your communication skills. And then the last thing, there is always building your professional network.
Yeah.
Kind of fits in with never stop learning. Go to the trade shows, go to the seminars. Don't skip out on the customer dinners, just always building your network.
Yeah, very good advice. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Pam. It was so interesting to talk with you. Can you give us your contact information or how listeners might be able to get in touch with you?
Yeah, I am on LinkedIn, and I couldn't tell you what my little LinkedIn magic page, but if you search my name, and I actually use my full name on LinkedIn, which is Pamela Blass, B as in boy, Lass, Bracher, B as in boy, Racher. So Pamela Blass Bracher. If you search it, you should find me. And then in addition, you can email me at the ATA, pbracher at trucking.org.
Okay, great. Thank you. And you can listen to more Frictionless Supply Chain podcasts posted on the Supply Chain Management Reviews landing page, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can reach me, Rosemary Coates, at rcoates@reshoringinstitute.org and visit our website at www.reshoringinstitute.org, where we publish all of our research on manufacturing in America. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.